I'd been running that Monday morning meeting for 30 years, and the one thing that never changed was that I walked through that door first. It was 7:58, 2 minutes before the hour, the hallway quiet, except for the sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor I had installed myself back when this building was still more ambition than reality. I had my coffee in one hand and my notepad in the other, and my mind already on the quarterly numbers I needed to address before anyone else in that room started drawing their own conclusions from them. The glass panel beside the conference room door showed me the room was already half full, people settling into their seats, laptops opening. The particular organized energy of a Monday morning when everyone is still finding their footing for the week. I reached for the door handle, and that is when Daniel stepped out of nowhere and put his hand flat against the door. He was breathing differently than normal, controlled but fast, the way a man breathes when he is managing something and doesn't want you to know how hard he is working at it. He looked at me and said quietly, almost under his breath, "Dad, don't come in here." I looked at his hand on the door, and then I looked at his face and I said, "Are you crazy? That's my meeting." He didn't move. He held my eyes and said, "Please, trust me, just go back to your office. Give me 20 minutes. I stood there in the hallway of the company I had built from nothing, my son blocking my own conference room door, and I did not know whether to be angry or afraid. I went back to my office. I don't fully know why I listened. Something in his face told me that whatever was on the other side of that door was something he had a handle on, and that my walking in would not help, but would hurt. I set my coffee on the desk and stood at the window and looked out at the parking lot and counted the cars the way I always do when I need to give my hand something while my mind works. 14 cars. I knew every one of them, had hired every person they belonged to. I stood there for 4 minutes, and then I walked back down the hallway and looked through the narrow crack where the conference room door met the frame. What I saw inside that room made me take a step back and put my hand against the wall to steady myself. What I was seeing through that crack told me that there were people using the trust I had placed in them to run the company with me as a weapon against me for longer than I wanted to believe. Thank you for being here today. Before I tell you what I saw through that crack, and I want you to understand that what I discovered in the days that followed nearly cost me everything I had spent 30 years building, I want to hear from you. Drop your state in the comments below and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this story. And one more thing before we go further, this story draws from real experiences and real emotions, but certain names and details have been adjusted to protect privacy. The heart of it is true. My name is Raymond Caldwell, and I am 63 years old. I started Caldwell Logistics in 1994 with a second-hand truck, a telephone, and a list of 12 potential clients that a friend of a friend had passed along to me on a piece of paper that I still have somewhere in the bottom drawer of my desk. I had no investors, no business degree, no family money to fall back on, nothing except 31 years of watching my father work himself into the ground for other people's companies, and a decision I made at 33 that I was going to build something of my own, or spend every remaining year of my life trying. The first 3 years were the kind of difficult that you can only fully describe to someone who has lived it. The missed payrolls, the contracts that fell through at the last moment, the nights when Patricia would sit across from me at the kitchen table, and we would go through the numbers together and then sit in silence because the numbers did not leave much to say. Patricia never once suggested I quit. Not once in 3 years of genuine uncertainty did she look at me and say, "Maybe this isn't working. Maybe we should think about something else." That is the kind of woman she was. By the time Daniel was born in 1988, the company had found its footing, not comfortable yet but stable, the difference between surviving and beginning to build. I remember bringing him home from the hospital and standing in the doorway of the room we had painted blue the weekend before, holding him in both arms and thinking that everything I was doing now had a different weight to it, a different reason. Patricia stood beside me and rested her head on my shoulder and said, "He's going to want to know what his father built." And I said, "Then I better make sure it's worth knowing about." That moment lived in me for 30 years. Every early morning and late night, every difficult negotiation and painful decision, I carried that moment like a stone in my pocket, something solid to reach for when the ground felt uncertain. Daniel grew up watching me build this company the way children absorb things, not through explanation, but through proximity, through the texture of daily life in a household where the business was always present at the dinner table, even when we weren't talking about it directly. Patricia passed 2 years ago from a stroke that arrived without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in April while she was gardening in the backyard. The neighbor found her and called the ambulance, and I was in a meeting with a client when my phone rang, and I looked at the number and something told me before I answered that the world was about to divide itself into 2 distinct periods. We had been married for 38 years. She had been present for every significant moment this company had ever had, every contract signed, and every crisis navigated, and every small victory that only the 2 of us knew the full weight of. Losing her rearranged something fundamental in me, something I am still in the process of understanding. And it brought Daniel and me closer in the way that shared loss sometimes does, stripping away the comfortable distance that grown children and their parents maintain, and leaving something more honest and more fragile in its place. He started coming into the office earlier after she passed, staying later, finding reasons to be present in a way that I understood was not entirely about the business. Daniel had joined Caldwell Logistics 4 years ago after a decade working in supply chain management for 2 larger companies in Atlanta. He had not come because I asked him to, which mattered to me then and matters to me more now. He had come because he wanted to, because he had spent 10 years learning the industry from the outside and decided he wanted to learn it from the inside of something that belonged to his family. We had one conversation before he started, just the 2 of us at the kitchen table in the house where he grew up, and I told him that inside this building he was Daniel Caldwell, the operations manager, not Daniel Caldwell, my son, and that if he wanted the respect of the people who worked there, he would have to earn it the same way everyone else had. He nodded and said he wouldn't have it any other way. And in 4 years, he had been true to that, had earned his place in that building through competence and consistency and a particular ability to read people and situations that reminded me so much of Patricia that it occasionally stopped me mid-conversation. The plan, unspoken but understood between us, was that Daniel would eventually take over the company. Not soon, not in any rush, but eventually when the time was right and the transition made sense for everyone involved. The company had grown considerably over the past decade. We had 63 employees across 3 locations, a fleet of 41 vehicles, contracts with regional distributors and 2 national retail chains that we had spent years cultivating and that formed the financial backbone of everything else we did. I was proud of what we had built, genuinely and specifically proud, in the way you can only be proud of something that cost you real years of real effort. And I had begun in the past 18 months to think seriously about what the next chapter looked like, what stepping back gradually might mean in practical terms, what I wanted the remaining years of my working life to actually feel like. Patricia and I had talked about travel, about mornings without alarms, about the particular luxury of time that we had deferred for 3 decades in service of something we believed in. Those conversations lived in me differently now that she was gone, but the shape of what I wanted had not entirely changed. It had just become something I would have to build alone. About 8 months ago, I began to notice something off in the rhythm of the business. It was not dramatic, nothing that announced itself clearly, more like a vibration in the floor that you feel before you can identify its source. Small discrepancies in the logistics reports that could each be explained individually, but that formed a pattern when you laid them side by side. A client relationship that had been warm for 6 years, suddenly running cool without any obvious reason. Emails answered slowly, meetings postponed twice in a row. A contract renewal that should have been straightforward taking on an unexpected hesitation. And something in the internal dynamic of the office that I could feel but not name. Conversations that stopped just slightly too quickly when I entered a room. A particular quality of attention from certain people that felt managed rather than natural. I mentioned it to Daniel once in passing, in the way you mention something you are not yet ready to make a formal concern. He listened carefully the way he always does, nodded, said he would keep his eyes open, and then changed the subject with a smoothness that I noticed, but did not examine closely enough at the time. 3 weeks later, he did it again, when I brought up the client renewal that was stalling, listened, nodded, redirected. I filed those moments away without fully understanding what I was filing. The way you store information your instincts have flagged, but your conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet. By the time that Monday morning arrived and my son put his hand flat against my conference room door, I had 6 of those filed moments sitting in the back of my mind, waiting to be understood. The Monday morning meetings had been the heartbeat of this company since the very beginning. Every week, without exception, the full leadership team gathered in that conference room at 8 o'clock, and we went through everything: numbers, operations, client relationships, staffing, anything that needed collective attention or collective decision-making. I ran those meetings myself, had always run them myself, believed in them the way I believed in the physical presence of showing up, in the particular accountability that comes from being in a room together rather than on a screen. Patricia used to say that the Monday meeting was my church, and she was not entirely wrong about that. It was the place where I took the full measure of the week ahead, where I looked at the people who had trusted me enough to build their livelihoods around this company and reminded myself what all of it was actually for. Walking through that door on Monday morning was not a habit, it was a ritual, and Daniel knew that better than anyone. Which is why when he put his hand against that door and asked me to trust him and walk away, I understood even in my confusion that whatever was happening inside that room had to be significant. My son did not ask for trust lightly. He had inherited that from Patricia, the understanding that trust is a specific and serious currency and that you do not spend it on small things. I went back to my office. I stood at the window. I counted the cars. And then, after 4 minutes, that felt considerably longer than 4 minutes, I walked back down that hallway and looked through the crack in the door. And I saw something that made me understand that the vibration I had been feeling in the floor for 8 months was not a malfunction. It was a warning. I went back to my office and closed the door behind me and stood in the middle of the room without sitting down. The image I had seen through that crack was still arranging itself into something my mind could fully process, the way a photograph develops slowly in a darkroom. The shapes becoming clearer and more specific the longer you stand there looking at them. I had seen Marcus Webb, my operations director, standing at the head of my conference table in the chair where I always sit, with a laptop open in front of him and a presentation on the screen behind him that I had never seen before and had certainly never authorized. And I had seen the faces of my leadership team turned toward him with an attention and a seriousness that told me this was not the first time they had gathered this way. What I had not seen, in the 4 or 5 seconds before I stepped back from the door, was my son anywhere in that room. Marcus Webb had been with Caldwell Logistics for 11 years. I had hired him out of a mid-size freight company in Birmingham, where he had been running operations for 6 years, brought him in because his reputation in the industry was excellent, and because the company had reached a size where I needed someone who could manage the operational complexity that I no longer had the bandwidth to manage alone. He was efficient, precise, the kind of man who arrived at meetings 2 minutes early and left them with a list of action items that were always followed through on. I had trusted him with access to our client relationships, our contracts, our internal financials, our vendor agreements, all of it, the full architecture of 30 years of work. Patricia had met him once at a company event and said afterward that he was very impressive and that she hoped he was as loyal as he was competent, because men like that always had options. I had told her she worried too much. I sat down at my desk and opened my computer and pulled up the internal server where we kept the company's financial records and contract files. I was not sure exactly what I was looking for, only that the image through that crack had activated something in me that had been trying to get my attention for 8 months, and that I was done giving it anything less than my full attention. The quarterly numbers I had been planning to address in the meeting that morning were pulled up first, and I went through them more carefully than I had gone through them in months, not looking at the summary figures, but going line by line through the underlying data the way I used to do in the early years, when every dollar had to be accounted for by hand. It took me 20 minutes to find the first thing that didn't belong. It was small, the kind of small that is designed to be invisible, a vendor payment that was slightly higher than the contracted rate, routed through a subsidiary account I didn't immediately recognize. I wrote it down on my notepad and kept going. By the time Daniel knocked on my office door, I had 4 items on that notepad, and a feeling in my chest that I recognized from the early years of the business, the specific feeling of standing at the edge of something you cannot see the bottom of. He came in and closed the door behind him and sat down across from me without being invited to, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. He looked like a man who'd been awake for most of the night, the particular exhaustion that doesn't come from physical effort, but from sustained mental and emotional pressure, the kind that settles around the eyes and in the set of the jaw. He looked at my notepad, and then he looked at me and he said, "How much did you see?" I said, "Enough. Now you tell me the rest." What came out over the next hour rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past 8 months. Daniel had first noticed something wrong 6 weeks ago, a discrepancy in a vendor contract that triggered something in him the same way it had triggered something in me that morning. A small thing that felt deliberately small, designed to pass beneath the threshold of attention. He had pulled the thread carefully, quietly, without telling me, because he had wanted to be certain before he brought it to me, and because he had understood instinctively that what he was uncovering involved someone I trusted deeply, and that I would need him to arrive with evidence rather than suspicion. Marcus Webb had been systematically diverting company funds through a network of shell vendor accounts he had constructed over the course of approximately 2 years. Amounts small enough individually to avoid triggering our standard financial review process, but significant enough in aggregate to represent a serious and deliberate theft from the company. Daniel had spent 6 weeks building a documentation trail that he had been planning to present to me and to our attorney this week. The Monday morning meeting that I had almost walked into was Marcus addressing the leadership team about a proposed restructuring plan, one that Daniel had discovered was designed to consolidate Marcus's control over the financial operations of the company in ways that would have made the diversion significantly harder to detect going forward. I sat at my desk and listened to my son lay out what he had found with the precision and calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times, who had prepared for my reaction and was managing it carefully. When he finished, I sat there for a moment without speaking. Outside my office window, the parking lot was full, the building going about its Monday morning around us, 63 people doing their work inside a company that someone had been quietly hollowing out from the inside for 2 years. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the 30 years of early mornings and difficult decisions and the specific cost of building something from nothing. The cost measured not in dollars, but in time, in missed weekends and deferred vacations, and the particular weight of responsibility that never fully leaves you, even when you walk out the door at the end of the day. I thought about Marcus Webb, sitting at the head of my conference table in my chair, and I felt something move through me that I had to sit very still to manage. I want to tell you something about betrayal that I did not fully understand until that Monday morning. I'd always thought of betrayal as a loud thing, a dramatic thing, something that announces itself with a clear before and after. What I learned sitting at that desk with my son across from me and 4 items on my notepad was that real betrayal is almost always quiet. It builds itself slowly, carefully, in the spaces where trust has made you comfortable enough to stop looking closely. It uses your own confidence in the people around you as the primary tool of its construction. Marcus Webb had not stolen from a stranger. He had stolen from a man who had given him 11 years of genuine trust and opportunity and professional respect. And he had done it carefully enough that the theft could have continued indefinitely if my son had not inherited his mother's instinct for sensing when something in a room was not what it was presenting itself to be. Daniel had one more thing to tell me, and he saved it for last, the way you save the heaviest thing for when the other person is already sitting down. 2 of the people in that conference room that morning were aware of what Marcus was doing. Not participants exactly, not co-conspirators in the legal sense, but aware, had seen things and chosen not to bring them to me, had made the calculation that their own positions were safer if they stayed quiet and maintained their proximity to Marcus, rather than their loyalty to the man who had hired them and built the company they worked for. He told me their names, and I wrote them down on the notepad beneath the 4 financial items. And I looked at the list, and I thought about all the Monday morning meetings we had sat through together, all the conversations and decisions and moments of collective problem-solving that I had believed were happening in good faith. I thought about how much of what you think you know about the people around you is actually just what they have chosen to show you. I asked Daniel why he hadn't told me sooner. He was quiet for a moment before he answered, the kind of quiet that means the answer is already formed, but the person is deciding how honest to be with it. Then he said, "Because you lost Mom 8 months ago, and I watched what that did to you. And I needed to be sure, before I put something else on you, that you couldn't unfeel once you knew it." I looked at my son across the desk, and I thought about Patricia standing in the doorway of Daniel's childhood bedroom, telling me that he was going to want to know what his father had built. I thought about what she would say about the man he had become, about the specific and careful way he had carried this for 6 weeks alone to protect both the company and his father at the same time. I did not trust myself to say much in that moment, so I said the thing that was most true. I said, "Your mother would be proud of you." He looked at the desk for a moment, and then he nodded and said, "I know. That's why I did it this way." We sat together in my office for a while after that, not talking much, the way you sit with someone after something significant has shifted and the words haven't caught up with it yet. The building moved around us, phones and footsteps and the ordinary sounds of a Monday morning. And I thought about the fact that somewhere in this building, Marcus Webb was finishing a presentation in my conference room, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already moved. He did not know that my son had spent 6 weeks building a case. He did not know that I had 4 items on a notepad and 2 names written beneath them. He did not know that the Monday morning meeting he had used my absence to run was the last one he would ever run in this building. Outside the window, the sun was fully up now, the parking lot bright and ordinary. 14 cars belonging to 14 people I had hired and trusted. I picked up my pen and looked at the notepad and thought about Patricia's voice telling me 38 years ago that she hoped Marcus Webb was as loyal as he was competent. She had worried about the right thing. She had just worried about it 11 years too early. I called our company attorney, Frank Delgado, at 10:15 that Monday morning and asked him to come to the office before noon. Frank had been handling Caldwell Logistics legal matters for 19 years, the kind of attorney who picks up on the first ring and asks questions later. And when I told him I needed him present for a termination meeting that involved potential criminal conduct, he said he would be there by 11:30 and that I should not speak to anyone involved before he arrived. I hung up and looked at Daniel sitting across from me and said, "We do this right. We do this once, and we do it completely." He nodded and said, "I have everything printed and organized in my car. I'll go get it." I watched him walk out of my office, and I sat there alone for a moment with the notepad and the silence and the particular feeling of a man who is about to do something that cannot be undone. I want to tell you what those 90 minutes between Daniel leaving my office and Frank arriving felt like, because I think it matters to the story. I did not spend them angry, which surprised me. I had expected anger, had braced for it, the hot, specific anger of a man who has discovered that someone he trusted has been stealing from him systematically for 2 years. What I felt instead was something quieter, and in some ways heavier, a deep and specific sadness for the version of Marcus Webb I had believed in, the version I had hired and promoted and defended in conversations where others had expressed reservations I had dismissed too quickly. I thought about the 11 years of Monday mornings, the contracts we had celebrated together, the operational problems we had solved side by side, all of it now recontextualized, all of it requiring me to go back through my own memory and re-examine what had been real and what had been performance. That is one of the specific cruelties of this kind of betrayal. It doesn't just take what it takes, it goes back and takes things that already happened. Frank arrived at 11:28 with his briefcase and his reading glasses and the particular calm of a man who has seen most things and stopped being surprised by them. Daniel spread the documentation across my desk, 6 weeks of careful work, printed and organized into a sequence that told the story clearly and completely. The shell accounts, the diverted payments, the pattern of escalating amounts, the restructuring proposal from that morning's meeting, and what it was actually designed to accomplish. Frank read through it methodically without speaking, turning pages, occasionally making a small note in the margin of his legal pad. When he finished, he took his glasses off and looked at us both and said, "This is thorough. This is very thorough." Then he looked at Daniel specifically and said, "How long did this take you?" Daniel said 6 weeks. Frank nodded slowly and said, "Your father is lucky to have you." I looked at my son across the desk, and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. We brought Marcus into my office at 12:15. Frank was seated to my left, Daniel to my right, the documentation stacked on the desk between us and Marcus's chair. Marcus walked in with the easy confidence of a man who believes he is walking into a routine conversation, and I watched that confidence change in real time as he registered Frank's presence and the stack of papers and the specific quality of silence in the room. He sat down and looked at me, and I looked back at him. And I thought about Patricia saying she hoped he was as loyal as he was competent. I said, "Marcus, we are going to go through some things together this morning, and I want you to listen completely before you say anything." He looked at the stack of papers, and something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. He said, "Raymond, whatever you think you found, I can explain." Frank put his hand up gently and said, "Mr. Webb, I'd strongly encourage you to listen first, as Mr. Caldwell suggested, and to consider calling your own attorney before this conversation goes much further. I will not walk you through every detail of what followed, because some of it is still in the hands of attorneys, and I want to be careful about what I say publicly. What I will tell you is that Marcus Webb did not deny what was in front of him for very long. The documentation Daniel had assembled was too complete, too specific, too carefully sequenced to be argued with, and Marcus was a smart enough man to understand quickly that the only thing left to decide was how this ended, not whether it ended. He was escorted from the building by 2:15 that afternoon. The 2 employees who had known and stayed silent were called in separately, given the opportunity to provide written accounts of what they had observed and when, and told clearly that their continued employment depended on complete cooperation going forward. By 4 o'clock that Monday, the building felt different, the way a room feels after you have opened the windows and let the air move through it. The client whose renewal had been stalling called me the following Thursday. He had heard through industry contacts that there had been a leadership change at Caldwell and wanted to understand what it meant for their relationship going forward. I told him directly what had happened, not every detail, but the shape of it, and I told him that the company he had trusted for 6 years was the same company it had always been, that its values had not changed, that the person responsible for the stall in their renewal process was no longer part of our operation. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Raymond, the reason we've worked with you for 6 years is because of exactly how you just handled this conversation." We signed the renewal the following week. In the month since that Monday, I have thought a great deal about what I almost missed and why I almost missed it. The 8 months of small signals I had noticed and filed without fully examining. The conversations with Daniel that I had not pushed far enough. The box of vendor discrepancies that I had attributed to administrative error rather than design. I had been distracted by grief, genuinely and legitimately distracted. And Marcus Webb had understood that and used it, had timed the acceleration of what he was doing to coincide with the period when my attention was at its most divided and my defenses at their most compromised. That is something I have had to sit with honestly, not with guilt but with clarity, because understanding exactly how it happened is the only way to make sure it does not happen again. What I have not had to sit with, not for a single moment, is any doubt about my son. Daniel had watched me lose Patricia and had made a decision in real time that his job in the months that followed was not just to learn this business, but to protect it and to protect me while I found my footing again. He had carried something heavy for 6 weeks in complete silence, had built a case thorough enough to satisfy a 19-year attorney, had blocked a conference room door on a Monday morning with his hand flat against it and asked his father to trust him, and had delivered on that trust completely. Patricia used to say that the truest measure of how you raised a child was not who they were when things were easy, but who they were when things required something of them. I know now exactly who my son is when something is required of him, and I know that whatever the next chapter of this company looks like, whatever the transition eventually means in practical terms, I am not leaving it in capable hands. I am leaving it in trustworthy ones. And after everything that Monday taught me about the difference between those two things, I understand that trustworthy is the one that matters. Proverbs 11:3 says, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity." I have run this company for 30 years on the belief that how you do things matters as much as what you accomplish, that the manner of the work is inseparable from the meaning of it. Marcus Webb was competent. He was genuinely, demonstrably competent. And for 11 years I believed that competence and integrity were traveling together in the same man. What that Monday taught me is that competence without integrity is not an asset. It is a liability waiting to mature. And what it taught me about grief is something I did not expect to learn from a betrayal. That the people who love us do not stop protecting us when we lose someone. Sometimes they protect us more carefully precisely because they understand how much we have already lost and how much we have left to lose. Daniel protected me and this company not because it was his job, but because it was his answer to the same question I had stood in his doorway asking myself 36 years ago. He had decided what his father had built was worth knowing about, and then he had decided it was worth protecting. If this story reached something in you today, I want you to take one thing from it before you move on. Pay attention to the small things that don't sit right. Not with paranoia, not with suspicion of everyone around you, but with the honest attentiveness of someone who has built something real and understands that real things require real guardianship. Trust is not naivety. Trust is something you extend deliberately to people who have earned it, and you reserve the right to examine that earning on a regular basis. Not because the people around you are suspects, but because the things you have built deserve that level of care. And if you have someone in your life who has ever blocked a door and asked you to trust them, and then delivered on that trust completely, tell them what that meant to you. Do not let that go unsaid. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and drop a comment below telling me this. Have you ever had someone in your life protect you from something before you even knew you needed protecting? How did you find out? And what did it change between you? Your story might be exactly what someone watching this right now needs to hear today. I'll see you in the next one.